Over the last decade, more than 3,000 New Zealand citizens have been deported from Australia under Section 501 of the Migration Act. After the 2014 amendments, deportations increased 16-fold. The law mandates that any non-citizen sentenced to 12 months or more automatically fails the character test, resulting in visa cancellations and deportation. Approximately 57% of those sent back to New Zealand reoffended, with 27% committing new crimes within a year. Some of these individuals were connected to outlaw motorcycle gangs, strengthening cross-border gang networks. What started as border enforcement has evolved into a complex legal, criminal, and diplomatic issue across borders. This video explains how Section 501 operates, why deportations surged, and the long-term effects on Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific. Before we go further, please subscribe to the channel. In recent years, a new wave of criminal deportees has been arriving from Australia, reshaping the safety and social landscape of New Zealand and the Pacific. These individuals are known as the 501s, named after Section 501 of the Australian Migration Act. Under this law, any non-citizen who fails Australia's character test can have their visa cancelled, and once that happens, deportation is automatic. This isn't just paperwork. It's a forced relocation of people with criminal histories, often sending them back to communities that are unprepared for the scale and nature of the threat. Since major changes to the law in 2014, deportations under Section 501 have surged 16-fold. Over 3,000 New Zealanders have been sent back across the Tasman, and the consequences are alarming. About 57% eventually reoffend, with 27% returning to crime within their first year. At its peak, Australia was deporting an average of 44 people every month, filling detention centres quickly. By February 2025, nearly 85% of 501 detainees had documented criminal histories. For the Australian government, the goal is clear: remove dangerous individuals and protect local communities. But the ripple effects haven't stopped at Australia's borders. Some deportees were senior members of outlaw motorcycle gangs, such as the Comancheros, Mongols, and Rebels. Once in New Zealand, they didn't disappear, they reorganised. Gangs strengthened existing chapters, created new networks, and spread their influence across the Pacific. Local rivalries evolved into structured cross-border operations, backed by hierarchies, international contacts, and experience operating in Australia's harsher criminal environment. What had once been loose, motorcycle clubs began operating with coordination, strategy, and sophistication. In attempting to remove a domestic threat, Australia inadvertently exported elements of its gang culture, turning local disputes into a regional crisis. As 501-linked influence expanded, New Zealand authorities responded with force. Large-scale operations were launched to regain control and disrupt gang visibility. Operation Cobalt ran from June 2022 through December 2024. It focused on firearms, drugs, and overt gang presence. Over 2.5 years, it resulted in 107,073 charges and the seizure of more than 750 firearms. The scale of enforcement was designed to send a message: the rapid expansion phase was over. But the real shift came in November 2024 with the introduction of the Gangs Act. The law banned the public display of gang insignia. Wearing a patch in public was no longer just symbolic. It was illegal. That's where Operation Nickel came in. Its focus was compliance. Between November 2024 and February 2025, police seized 76 patches and 316 additional insignia items. They filed 337 charges, specifically related to insignia breaches. Beyond the patches themselves, Operation Nickel led to 3,037 additional charges covering serious violence, drug trafficking, and firearms offences. The strategy wasn't only about symbolism, it was about pressure. By removing the ability to openly display gang insignia, the government aimed to weaken the aura that surrounds these groups. The patch carries status, it signals power. It attracts recruits. Stripping it away was an attempt to break that cycle. Critics, however, argue that visibility isn't the same as existence. When you push organised groups out of sight, they don't necessarily disappear. They adapt. The 501-linked networks were already comfortable using encrypted platforms and cross-border logistics. Losing the ability to wear a patch in public may simply accelerate the shift toward less visible, more digitally coordinated activity. New Zealand's crackdown marks a new phase. The street-level symbols are being targeted. The structures behind them remain more complex, more networked, and harder to dismantle. The 501 story isn't just about men being put on planes and sent to countries they barely remember. It's about how Australia's underworld stretched itself across borders. What started as deportation turned into globalization. One of the clearest examples is what investigators began calling the Aussie cartel. This wasn't a street crew. It was a network of senior crime figures who treated exile like a business opportunity. Senior leaders from the Comanchero Motorcycle Club, including Hakan Ayik and Juax Nakuru, helped turn Istanbul into a new coordination point for Australian organised crime. From Turkey, they were linked to operations that fed the demand for methamphetamine and cocaine back in Australia and New Zealand. Hakan Ayik, known as Big Hucks and sometimes dubbed the Facebook Gangster, became the face of this new era. He fled Australia in 2010. Reports later suggested he underwent plastic surgery and began living under a Dutch identity while running a luxury hotel business in Istanbul. It looked like a reinvention. In reality, authorities allege he remained deeply connected to large-scale drug trafficking. In a twist few could have predicted, Ayik was unknowingly used by the FBI to promote Anom, an encrypted messaging platform that was secretly designed to be accessed by law enforcement. Criminal networks across the world adopted it. In November 2023, Ayik was arrested along with 36 others. Turkey, once seen as a safe operating base, was no longer secure. But by then, the structure had already taken shape. Authorities estimate that the network, often described as the Aussie cartel, was generating around $1.5 billion a year. Even as key figures were arrested, the system didn't simply collapse. Mark Buddle was extradited to Australia in 2022. Duax Dax Ngakuru was arrested in Turkey in January 2023. Yet the influence of the organisation continued through figures like Shane Ngakuru, who operated from Thailand before pleading guilty to racketeering in 2025. In New Zealand, the Comanchero presence was tied to individuals such as Pasilika Naufahu. He was denied parole in late 2022 and again in 2023, with the parole board stating he remained a high risk of reoffending due to his continued commitment to the gang's structured, corporate-style ideology. What the 501s brought back with them wasn't just physical presence, it was operational knowledge. When Naufahu was arrested in 2019, police seized more than $3.7 million in assets. Luxury vehicles, high-end jewelry, property. This wasn't low-level dealing, it reflected a shift toward asset accumulation and financial layering. The model had evolved. Instead of relying purely on visible street intimidation, these networks adopted a structure that mirrored legitimate enterprise, clear roles, financial planning, international supply chains. The kind of setup that makes disruption far more difficult. The 501 phenomenon didn't just relocate crime, it reshaped how it was organised. Section 501 contains the character test, which allows the minister or their delegate to refuse or cancel a visa if a person is suspected of not being of good character. The most decisive element is Section 5013A, the mandatory cancellation provision. If a non-citizen is serving a custodial sentence and has a substantial criminal record, defined as either a single sentence of 12 months or more, or multiple sentences totaling at least 2 years, their visa must be cancelled. There is no initial discretion in these cases. Over time, legal commentators began calling this blending of immigration enforcement and criminal punishment crimmigration. Deportation doesn't replace prison, it follows it. After serving their sentence, a person moves into immigration detention, loses daily contact with family, and is ultimately removed from the country. In late 2025, the legal landscape shifted with the High Court case Davis v. Minister for Immigration, which found that departmental officers were exercising too much subjective discretion when handling ministerial intervention requests. The court ruled this approach was inconsistent with the structure of the Act. In response, Immigration Minister Tony Burke introduced new ministerial instructions in September 2025. The older 2016 and 2017 guidelines, considered broad and flexible, were replaced with clearer, objective criteria. The reforms ensured that the minister personally makes the final decision on interventions. Under the post-September 2025 system, departmental staff can no longer rely on open-ended assessments of compassionate or compelling circumstances unless strict conditions are met. The Administrative Appeals Tribunal, creating a tighter, more transparent process designed to withstand judicial scrutiny. However, a tighter process also means fewer cases advance. For someone facing deportation, the outcome now rests with a single political officeholder focused on community protection and ensuring compliance with Australian law. Consider the case of Teresa Awina, Rangi, who arrived in Australia as a child in 1996, she lived in the country for 30 years, raising 4 Australian-born children. Between 2005 and 2024, she accumulated 131 offences and was warned 3 times that her conduct could lead to visa cancellation. In late 2025, she was deported. The Administrative Review Tribunal ruled that community protection outweighed her family ties. Her case illustrates how the current framework operates. But when criminal behaviour is extensive and ongoing, the balance now decisively favours removal. For the 501 linked networks, technology isn't optional. It's the backbone of the business: drug shipments, payments, supply routes, recruitment. Almost everything runs through encrypted communication. Over the past few years, criminal groups have moved rapidly away from traditional darknet forums and into end-to-end encrypted messaging apps like Telegram and Signal. Telegram in particular became attractive because of its ability to host massive channels up to 50,000 users, making it easy to advertise, recruit, and coordinate at scale. But that digital shift created a vulnerability. Operation Trojan Shield, better known as the Anam Sting, changed the world. Anam was marketed as a secure, hardened messaging device built specifically for criminals. In reality, it was secretly run by the FBI and the Australian Federal Police. Every message sent through it was quietly copied and stored. The distribution strategy was key. Devices were seeded into criminal circles through trusted figures, including Hakan Ayik and Shane Gakuru. Once influential players vouched for the system, others followed. Law enforcement didn't just infiltrate conversations, they gained a live feed into some of the most sensitive discussions in the underworld. In January 2025, Shane Gakuru pleaded guilty in a US federal court to racketeering conspiracy. He admitted that he sold Anam devices, knowing they would be used to traffic at least 50 kilograms of cocaine. In encrypted messages, he described how 7 kilograms of methamphetamine were hidden inside commercial lightboxes designed to be scan-proof. For investigators, Anam was a breakthrough. For criminal networks, it was a wake-up call. The technology battle hasn't slowed down. Moving into 2026, regulators like the US Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission have taken a harder stance on so-called ephemeral messaging apps that automatically delete evidence. While agencies like CISA still recommend secure platforms like Signal for legitimate encryption needs, law enforcement has aggressively targeted platforms built specifically for criminal use, such as Ghost and Sky ECC. The message is clear: encryption alone is no longer protection. As a result, 501 linked syndicates have adapted again. It's not just about which app you use, it's about who you trust. Underground networks are now applying their own version of Know Your Customer principles. Associates are vetted carefully, devices are scrutinized, membership is tightened. The digital shadows have become more cautious because Anam proved they can be lit up at any time. Behind the headlines about cartel figures and encrypted phones is a quieter reality. Many 501 deportees aren't high-level operators. They are people sent to a country they haven't lived in since early childhood. For some, deportation feels like a second sentence layered on top of the first. They leave prison in Australia only to be placed in detention, then flown to New Zealand with little support waiting. Family, children, partners all remain behind. The psychological toll can be severe. Data from 2025 shows that 44% of prisoners in Australia had been diagnosed with a mental health disorder in the year before incarceration. When deported, those existing issues don't disappear. In many cases, they intensify. Without stable housing, employment, or family support, some fall back into the only structure they recognise: gang networks. This helps explain why 57% of deportees eventually reoffend in New Zealand. Consider Sauni Sini, a 55-year-old who has lived in Australia for 25 years. He said he had hundreds of relatives there. In February 2026, he was deported because of a history of family violence. The decision severed him from his entire support network in a single move. Then there's Dion Robert Taiapa. Taiapa was a high-profile 501 deportee who had spent around 2 decades moving in and out of Australian prisons. After being returned to New Zealand, he quickly became involved in a sophisticated fraud scheme. Authorities later sentenced him for laundering $662,000 through gold bullion purchases. The operation involved hacking a lawyer's email account during a property transaction. The victim lost the remaining balance needed to buy a new home. The gold bars Taiapa purchased with the stolen funds have never been recovered. His case shows how some 501 deportees arrive with nothing more than a suitcase and restraints and still manage to re-enter high-level criminal activity almost immediately. The 501 policy was designed as a protective measure, but the human consequences, the technological arms race, and the cross-border ripple effects reveal something far more complex. The story isn't just about removal, it's about what happens next. The 501 policy hasn't just reshaped crime statistics. It has strained relationships across the Pacific. Leaders in the region have repeatedly raised concerns that Australia is exporting its problems rather than solving them. For smaller Pacific nations with limited resources, absorbing deportees with complex criminal histories isn't a minor administrative issue, it's a national security challenge. The Boe Declaration on Regional Security formally recognises criminal deportations as a serious regional threat. That wording matters. It reflects how deeply the issue has cut into diplomatic trust. This tension plays out at the same time Australia is trying to strengthen ties across the Pacific, especially as geopolitical competition in the region intensifies. Canberra often speaks about the Pacific family, about partnership and shared security, but many Pacific leaders argue that deportation policy tells a different story. One of the most sensitive points is reintegration support. There have been reports that Australia has declined to fund even basic infrastructure for deportees in countries like Tonga, including simple necessities such as tables and chairs for halfway houses. For communities already stretched thin, that lack of financial backing reinforces the perception that responsibility ends once the plane lands. At the same time, the criminal ecosystem has become more interconnected. Asian trafficking networks have reportedly used 501 linked gangs as intermediaries, super facilitators, for drug and human trafficking routes that cut through what some now call the Pacific Triangle. Smaller island nations find themselves caught in a web that stretches from Australia to Southeast Asia and beyond. The influence of these exiled figures is not limited to the streets. It has reached courtrooms and media outlets. In June 2024, journalist Timur Soikan was sued by Duax Nigakuru after reporting on alleged criminal connections. The lawsuit itself became part of the story, illustrating how some of these deported figures continue to wield significant wealth and legal leverage far from Australia's shores. What was framed as a domestic border protection measure has evolved into a diplomatic fault line. As 2026 unfolds, the numbers suggest this cycle isn't slowing down. Australia's prison population grew by 6% in 2025, climbing to nearly 47,000 inmates. The national imprisonment rate reached 216 per 100,000 people, the highest level since 2019. New Zealand-born prisoners continue to make up roughly 2% of the total prison population. That means the deportation pipeline remains active. The June 2025 census data shows that acts intended to cause injury account for 29% of incarcerations, while sexual assault represents 17%. These categories continue to drive prison admissions. One statistic stands out. Offences involving prohibited and regulated weapons and explosives rose by 41% in 2025. That surge has serious implications under Section 501. A single sentence of 12 months or more can trigger mandatory visa cancellation. As weapon-related offences increase, so does the likelihood that more non-citizens will meet the threshold for failing the character test. For the 501 cohort, that trend signals more removals ahead. What began as a border control mechanism has transformed into an ongoing system, a continuous loop linking prison, detention, and deportation. The term crimmigration captures that fusion. It is no longer just about who crosses the border, it is about what happens after conviction, after sentencing, and after release. The 501 policy has shifted Australia's border from a line on a map to a permanent process. And as prison numbers climb and laws tighten, its impact on the Pacific region looks set to deepen for years to come. And that's the story of the 501 invasion, a policy meant to protect communities that has instead reshaped crime, technology, and diplomacy across the Pacific. If this deep dive gave you a new perspective on how borders, law, and crime intersect, don't forget to subscribe for more investigative breakdowns like this. And we want to hear from you. What do you think about the 501 policy and its ripple effects? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and join the conversation. Because understanding the full story means asking the hard questions, and your voice matters.